good to see everybody tonight. I'm always grateful to be back and to be able to visit with you guys and to lead a class. By the way, I don't think this is going to be a sermon. We'll see how that goes. You know how that always plays out with me. But anyway, just to see everybody, to visit with everybody, what a blessing. It was almost a double blessing tonight, though. What we've been doing at Avalon over the past, 20 years is building a building. And we have utilized some Wednesday nights and some Sunday nights for devotional time and work time. I almost coordinated the work time for laying the last little bit of sod tonight. Almost had it. And then we didn't quite get there, so I'm going to have to take part in that a little bit later. There were going to be plenty of hands on deck. I wasn't even going to have to touch. But if you can come up with an excuse on Friday, I can come speak again. Tonight we're going to be talking about the burning bush. What book is that in? The book of Exodus. Is that Old Testament or New Testament? Old Testament. All right. In what book is the book of Exodus in the Old Testament? What's the book? The Bible. What is the Bible? The book. Well, I can do this all night, by the way. All right, so the Bible, sometimes we say it this way, is it's the divinely inspired record of God's unfolding plan to rescue fallen man. That's what it is. It's the inspired record of God's plan to rescue fallen man. And in the midst of that book, somehow, a story about a man named Moses is necessary and makes sense. But what I want to hasten and say that I appreciate the nature of this series, the idea of true lessons from childhood Bible stories. Sometimes we get the impression that these are, and especially from the outside world and hearing the clamor from it, that these are just fairy tales or myths or something like that. But sometimes the fault lies with us because maybe we've taught it in such a way. And trying to get certain lessons across to children, for example, we use colorful material and cartoons and things like that, and I'm not opposed to those things, but there is a time when we have to emphasize that this is not just a cartoon. This is not a cartoon. This really happened, and it happened for a reason. And the reason that it happened, ultimately speaking, the reason that Moses was put in a river as a baby was for your salvation. I mean, we can connect those dots easily, right? If the entirety of the Bible is all about our rescue, our redemption, then all of the events that transpired, especially those purposed and planned by God, not necessarily talking about the opposition that came against God's people, but as far as His plans and His purposes, everything ties together and culminates in our redemption. So Moses is... And his story, and by the way, he's the central human figure, right, of the book of Exodus. Who is the central figure of the book of Exodus? God. God, Jesus or God. Those are always the right answers, we know. That was a softball. God is. I mean, he's the central figure, but as far as the human figure who is central to the story, what do we learn about him? What do we learn from him? Especially in this moment at the burning bush. So I think that maybe and this is kind of vague, I know, but somewhat of the larger takeaway is this, that in order for me to be who I am designed by God to be, I'm going to have to recognize God for who He is, and I'm going to have to therefore recognize me for who I am. I have to see myself as I stand in God's presence. And that's what I think a lesson that we can gain from the burning bush is that how Moses reacted in the presence of God. says probably a lot about us as well. So with that in mind, I want to do a few things. I want to just kind of lead up to this. Moses, the name or the word means drawn out. Somebody read, if you will, Exodus chapter 2, verse 10 for us. Exodus 2, verse 10.
And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water."
Okay, so the name means drawn out, and we can kind of see this throughout his life. He's drawn out of the river in chapter 2, verse 10. He's drawn into a struggle. What's that struggle in verses 11 through 14? What's the struggle? He killed an Egyptian. He literally had a struggle, didn't he? But there was a greater struggle under consideration, because if we go back to the beginning of Exodus, knowing everything leading up to this, here are God's people in a foreign land. Moses is put in this ark of bulrushes, right, as an infant in order to save him, and yet his mother is the one that ends up being his what? As who is footing the bill? Pharaoh is paying the mother as he rears through his daughter, Moses. What was supposed to happen to all the male children? Right. So do you see the irony here? Do you see God at work in all of that? Again, it's just, I think one of the greatest parts of that is that Pharaoh is footing the bill here. All right. So anyway, he struggles against an Egyptian. Why did he struggle? Because what did he assume, presume, or what conclusion had he drawn? Why did he do this? You can look at the text if you want to cheat. What's that? He was beating up one of the Hebrews. There was a struggle going on between a Hebrew and an Egyptian. He knew he was one of them, and he had a sense of what else? That he was called by God to be a deliverer. And I don't know that the scriptures detail how that came to be. It's just an assumption somehow that Moses had drawn, or a conclusion that he had drawn, somehow probably from his mother. But was the timing right yet? No. So he murders a man, and then what ends up happening? He's drawn away to a foreign land. Why? Because of the murder, but ultimately he was found out, right? So he's drawn away into this foreign land. I think it's around verse 20, I can't remember, where he has a son and names him. Somebody find that for me. I should probably open my Bible too, not be a hypocrite here. Okay. What does that say?
He gave birth to his son, and he called his name Preston, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land."
Okay. But was Moses, when he was in Egypt, was that home? No. I mean, what's the backstory? Remember, God had brought the Israelites into Egypt and Goshen, right? They settled there, but is that where they belong? So Moses was in a foreign house, Pharaoh's house, in a foreign land, Egypt. Now, having fled to another foreign land. All right, so I'm probably getting way too much in the weeds here. So now this is where we're coming to. He's drawn into God's presence. So this is really what we're studying from chapter 3:1 to 4:20. But something happens in between. So let's go ahead and read chapter 2. Let's read 23 to 25, somebody.
And it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of bondage, and they cried. Their cry came up to God by reason of bondage. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto
Okay, so apparently God had gotten very busy and forgot about these people, right? Is that what that says? What does it mean that he remembered? Had he forgotten a covenant? Had he forgotten a promise? It was time. It was time to fulfill that. All right? So that's kind of the context in which we find the events that begin in chapter 3. All right? So with this in mind, let's do this. Let's look, first of all, at his curiosity. Somebody read verses 1 through 3 for us. 1 through 3.
Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of the bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn.
Okay, so he sparks his curiosity. God sparks the curiosity of Moses. Can you think of other events in the Bible where similar things happen, where God sparks the attention of people or the interest of people? I'm going to be disappointed if you can't. The Transfiguration? Yeah. He got the attention of the apostles, didn't he? There we go. There we go. That was it, right? That was the attention grabber. It was the confirmation that what was about to be said or what had been said was from God. It got people's attention. The resurrection. All right. So this burning bush. So here's the question. Has God sparked your interest? I'm not saying, if I did ask if he's appeared to you, let's have a discussion afterwards, but I'm not asking that. What I'm asking is that has some event in your life caused you to stop in your tracks and question perhaps everything around you? I can remember a point in my life, I was probably a teenager, staring in the mirror, just staring in my own eyes, asking the question, why am I not somebody else? Why am I me? Who am I? Anybody else do that? I don't. Maybe I'm confessing some things here that I should just keep to myself. Have you ever had a moment like that? What is this all about? I don't know maybe if this experience is familiar to those reared in the church or not, because I was at a point where I had no clue. Maybe if you're reared from day one to know that there is a God and that you are created in His image, maybe that takes care of that problem. But I can assure you that it confronted me. So what are some other things in life that might do that? What can God use? And I want to be careful with that too. Let me clarify this. From our vantage point, we cannot absolutely know with some event in life that was God, right? Especially when it comes to tragedies or whatever. Wasn't that Job's problem? That was a big problem with Job. God is doing all this to me, was He? No. But does or has God done things to people? Hello, the Bible, all right? So He can grab our attention. Obviously, He has done so in the past in miraculous ways, but can He grab our attention perhaps in other ways? I guess that's what I'm asking. Is that possible? Absolutely. Give me some scenarios now. How? The birth of a child. Why? What does that?
One, it just seems just beyond imagination, and it then changes your entire life for the rest of your life. Everything is different after that moment.
At least it should be.
When that child gets married and moves away.
When that child gets married and moves away. Yep.
For me, I had a moment like you. I wasn't raised in the church, and it was a death. And I was at a funeral, and there was nobody else at this funeral except immediate family members, like 4 people. And I thought, there's got to be more.
Is this it? Yeah.
And that's what took me on my
So tragedy or just brushing up against some event like that in life. I got to say, to add to the prayer list, if you don't mind, my dad, Travis Silcox. He learned just recently that, I can't remember, it's the vertebral artery. I'll talk to Joe Wilson about this. Dr. Joe. Okay, say it again. Okay, so it feeds, it's the other artery that feeds the back, it feeds the back of the brain and so forth. His has a 95% blockage. 100% they can't do anything. So surgery, hopefully any day, we'll see. But guess what? Guess whose attention has been gotten? Dad's talking about church a little bit more now, right? Those kinds of moments. So someone else's death, or the realization that I am mortal and I might not have long. That those kinds of events can stop us in our tracks, right? So I'm glad that Richard brought up a child, because all I could think of on my end of things were negative right now. But that's the case, though. Sometimes God will allow those events. So we have to ask ourselves: has that happened? What did that look like? So that's something for you to think about. All right. So in the next place, so that was how God got his attention. Now we notice this idea of Moses' caution. Somebody read 4 through 6 for us.
When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see God, called him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place in which you are standing is holy ground. 6.
Yeah.
And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God.
Okay. So.
How many times God actually speaks to the prophet? When the word of God comes to the prophet in the Bible, he actually says the name a few times. Samuel, Moses.
Yep. Abraham. Remember that? What is that? What's with that repetition? Attention. Maybe I should have made that point number 1. He's grabbing attention, right? And this makes Moses proceed with caution. He has found himself in the presence of God. So going back to these things from the first point, when your attention has been grabbed, now what?
Do you think today if God came to you, you heard a voice coming to your room, he called your name, sir, I don't know your name, he called you twice, would you recognize that as the Father? What would you do in that moment?
I would probably fall down dead. How do we see that playing out in the scriptures?
Samuel thought that it was his name first,
He did.
right?
Thought it was Eli.
Yeah, I said name because that's the personal experience. I didn't say Hebrew, but it was Eli.
Okay.
It was Eli that he thought that it was. He rushed up, he was nervous and scared.
So Eli has to tell him who to listen.
Yes.
Here again, that's right. All right, so with this idea of, and again, there's great caution and reverence. Don't you see that? I think this is a great point. So what happens when we're in the presence of God? And again, I'm not saying that he's going to appear to you in a burning bush. I'm saying those moments wherein you've come face to face with mortality or whatever. You've come face to face with the idea God exists and I am held accountable to him. How do we respond? Cautiously is the idea. That's what Moses is doing. I have a question. You guys help me out, because it just occurred to me when I was reading this a few days ago, and then I thought about it again today. I should have researched it more. But looking at that text, I'm going to come back. What I'm asking you is, how do you picture the events going on? So if I start rambling and can't remember where I was, that's my point here. What was my point? How do you picture what's happening here? All right, I had a buddy of mine, preacher. Actually, you guys know him. Barry Grider held a gospel meeting for us several years ago. So Barry said that he was in Washington, D.C. for an event, and Charlton Heston was there when he was the president of the NRA. And after the speech or whatever, Barry was with a friend of his, and he said, "I'm going down front." And his buddy said, "Oh, you want to meet the president of the NRA?" And he's like, "No, I want to meet Moses." All right, so how do you picture this event? Something occurred to me looking at the text is that I don't know that Moses got close to that burning bush at all. Look at it again. So the angel of the Lord, verse 2, appears to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, but the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why this bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw him turn aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush, "Moses, Moses, here am I. Do not draw near this place." And then he even has him take off his sandals where he is. Does that seem to track?
That's similar to the mountain when the children of Israel told not to touch the mountain.
Lest they die, lest they be consumed.
So they put up a blockade so that they can't even get close to it.
Don't even get close to it, which is, so consistent in the same book, right? Do not come near.
It's interesting that that's the beginning of the relationship, which he had a relationship clearly before, but the intimate relationship that Moses has with God here begins. And later, as you see him become the leader, it's one of my favorite encounters and
Yep.
descriptions is when he's described as being literally as a friend. They spoke to one another as
a
if they
friend.
were friends.
Yep.
So the communication was kind of casual.
So this is a growing relationship, right? Another takeaway there. I mean, do we come up from the water full grown and mature? The new birth gives birth to adults. No birth does. Right? We start out as babies, and we continue the process of sanctification. What is sanctification? Setting aside for a holy purpose. All right, so we have been set aside. We were sanctified, justified, right? Romans talks about this. When we became Christians. But does God continually set us aside for His purpose? Yes. So sanctification is an ongoing process as well in some ways. Okay, so his caution. What do we do as a result of being in His presence? So hopefully, I think that there at least needs to be reverence. He's gotten my attention. I'm coming to an understanding of who He is. Am I going to listen to Him? So, number 3, His commission. Somebody read 7 through 9 for us.
That's one thing we talked
Yeah.
about that. You gotta remember that. That was when Horeb was the mountain of God. He knew about the mountain, how special it was.
Yeah.
And then to the people around.
Yeah. In fact, He's going to tell him that it'll be a sign for him when he comes back to this place with God's people. Yeah, great point. All right. Somebody want to read 7 through 9?
Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, land flowing with milk and honey, from the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them.
What was it?
Okay.
What was the taskmaster?
What's that?
What was the task?
Or the
Driver, right?
slave driver. Yeah.
Luke 8:29. What drove that man into the tombs? It's symbolic.
Oh, the spirit, the demon? Yeah. All right. All right, so what's the commission here? 7 through 9. What's the commission?
To lead the Israelites out of Egypt.
Yeah. That's it. So, all right, so the question here is, have you contemplated God's call? All right, let's clarify this before we go any further. 2 Thessalonians 2:14. Somebody want to read that one for us? And in Matthew 28:18 through 20, we'll just do that for an example. But by what does God call us today? Let's read this verse. Okay? Who's got it? Not all at once.
To this he called you through our gospel, so that you may obtain the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Okay, so we're called by the gospel of Christ, right? That's how God calls. Remember the story of the boy that was in the field with his daddy a long time ago, picking the harvest. He looks up at the clouds and he sees a G and a P, and he starts running toward the house, and his dad stops him. Boy, where are you going? He pointed up to the G and the P, and he says, look, Dad, I've been called to go preach. He said, boy, get back in the field. That means go pick. All right, so how are we called by God? We are called by the gospel. Called by the gospel. And so we're called by the gospel to do certain things. We're called to obey it, to surrender to it, and so on. But I mentioned Matthew 28:18 through 20. What is that? The Great Commission. So what's the call? What's the command of the Great Commission? What is it? Go make disciples. Go make disciples. Preach the gospel to every creature. So we are commissioned as well. Here's some news. You're no Moses. So the applications here only go so far, but neither am I, right? You're no apostle, neither am I. But all of us have been given the same task, right? Go preach. Go preach. Now, that's kind of multifaceted though, right? You've done Bring, Teach, Keep, right? You know that there are areas that some person might be better in, that another one might flourish and be encouraged to do certain things more so than other things. And we all fill our role, right? Play a part in the work of evangelism. So there's another principle here that we can contemplate, I think, for a moment. The idea of counting the cost. Didn't Jesus say something about that? What's the gist of it? Do you remember? He gave a couple of examples even.
Know what you're getting into.
Know what you're getting into.
You're committing to, and what that means, and what that entails, and what that involves.
Okay, so take your mind back to for just a moment to the time of Christ. He's doing miracles. He's feeding people. It's the dinner and the show thing. People start following him, right? They're attracted to him because that's an attractive thing. He feeds you. He entertains you. But were they in it for the long haul? Few, right? Yeah. John chapter 6, what ends up happening? Yeah. They turn their backs. They leave. So, Jesus cautions those that would be his followers to carefully consider the costs. Now, is he trying to deter us from following him?
It's difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. This is not I think some people view Christianity as a crutch. You know, you can't make it through life without your dependence on your religion or whatever. And so you participate in religion, and that makes everything easy for you. Have you ever heard anybody argue like that? Obviously spoken by someone that's never tried it. It's a disciplined life.
Is it Marx that called it the opiate for the people? Is that?
Who called it the opiate of the, was it Lenin? Marx? What? No, Marx. What's that? Lenin.
Not a crush, it's a yoke.
It's a yoke. It's a burden. So you need to be freed from it. What happens when we're freed from it? Look around. Right? That's what's happening in our culture. People are attempting to free themselves from the yoke of God's will. What are they doing? Just enslaving themselves and other things. Okay, I don't know where I was going. Okay, contemplating, that's right, God's will. This means that we have to be, we can't be accidental Christians. Can we? Or casual Christians? There's no place for that at all in the Scriptures. thought I saw a hand. So what did Jesus say? He that is not with me is against me. He that gathers not with me, the rest of that, scatters abroad. Okay. So we have a choice to make, and we have to contemplate what that's going to cost us. All right, so now, point number 4. I only have 20 points. We're well on our way. His collision. Who wants to read 3:10 through 4:17? We're not going to do that. We won't do that. But what is the gist of this? Let me at least start reading at verse 10. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. How does verse 11 begin? But Moses said to God. So what does this section include? What happens from this point on to the next several verses? Tries to get out. Yeah, he begins to make excuses. I don't know that I question the sincerity of his excuses. What about you? Do any of them look like they were? Think about this. Where we started a few minutes ago is that Moses felt or understood that the burden of being the deliverer of God's people was on him. And then he messed that up. And so he flees, and he finally puts all of that behind him, apparently. It's done. How long has it been before the call?
Years.
40. Yeah. 40 years. Don't you think that, those of you that can remember 40 years back, was that a long time ago? Seems like a moment, I know, but the fact is what? The years have compounded, haven't they? It's a long time ago. Moses is like, I have moved on with things, but he still felt like a stranger, didn't he? But he had moved on. And so here is God. So this is what we mean by this idea of a collision. God is going to use him to deliver his people. Moses is determined that God is not going to use him to deliver his people. So this is a collision course. Who's going to win? We know. We know God's going to win on this one. But not without him attempting to get out of it. All right, so what were some of the things that he attempted to use, excuse-wise?
I'm not good enough.
His speech, I'm not good enough.
They won't believe me.
They won't believe me.
Who is your God?
Yeah,
Who's that?
who is that? All right, so I've listed it out like this. I'm unimportant. That's verses 11 and 12. Who am I to do this? Who am I? Verses 13 through 22, I'm uninformed. I don't know how to even answer these basic questions. Who do I say sent me? Verses 1 through 9 of chapter 4, I'm unbelievable. Nobody's going to listen to me. Verses 10 and 12 of chapter 4, I'm unfit. I can't do this. And then verses 13 through 17, I'm unnecessary. Just get somebody else. Get somebody else. So here's how God answers each of those things. I'm unimportant. God confirms his own presence. Part of me wants to kind of add this kind of into the idea of the text. Is like God is saying, yeah. When he says I'm unimportant, yeah. But I'm the one that's going to do this. And that's why I stated earlier that the central figure of the book of Exodus is God. Moses is the human part, but God is the central figure. God is going to be the one that's going to do this. He will use Moses to accomplish it, but God is the one doing these things. So in the second one, I'm uninformed, he tells him exactly who God is, God's person. I'm providing you the information that you need. I'm unbelievable, chapter 4, verses 1 through 9, God's power. There were 3 miracles there. Do you remember what they were? The staff, what happens to the staff? Turns to a snake, and then he's told to do what? First of all, what did he do when it turned into a snake? Yeah, he was frightened like any sane person would be. But then he's told to pick it up. And he does. There may be something to do with power over the Egyptian gods here. What was on the front of the Pharaoh's headdress? Yeah. There may be something about God's power over this. What's the next miracle that happens? Leprosy. Put your hand in your bosom, pull it out. It's leprosy. Any cure for that back then? No. Put it back in, then what? It's healed. That's power over any medical science that's been accomplished by the Egyptians. They can't do that. God, that's by God's power. And then what was the other one? The third one? Water to blood. And when you pour it on the ground, it becomes blood. You've heard? I know that there are seemingly scientific, non-miraculous explanations for the plagues. You've heard those before. I'm not going to get into it, but one of those, that there was some bacteria maybe that turned the water, death of the fish, turned the water red. What does he do here? He takes water, pours it on the ground, and it becomes what? Yeah. Hard to get around that one. So again, power. What? Power. All right. So again, the focus here is that, Moses, you can't. All right, Moses, you're unfit. The fact is, there's a sense in which you are unnecessary, right?
Where did that power come from?
Which power?
The power. It was Moses pouring a cup on the ground.
Yep.
Similar to Jesus and
Came-
healing people with God's finger.
Came from God. That's right.
So, yeah.
That's the demonstration here. This is God's power. And so he needs to know that he's going to be a part of God's plan. So God is going to take care of things. He's the one that's in control. And so now let's go back to kind of where we started. Well, point number 20. His conviction. Verse 17, after all of these excuses, going back to chapter 4 now. He ends with, "And you shall take this rod in your hand, with which you shall do the signs." So now somebody read 18 through 20. These are after all the excuses, all the attempts to escape responsibility. Now what?
Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see whether they are still alive." And Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." And the Lord said to Moses and Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead." So Moses took his wife and his sons, and they had them run on a donkey, and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand.
All right, so that's how God completed his command. He's convicting him of what he needs to do, and it works. All of the excuses, all of the reasons that he gave to not do this, God answered them all. What are some excuses that we sometimes come up with to avoid responsibility? Too busy? I'm not ready. Don't know enough. Somebody else will do it. Yeah. Think about that one for just a minute. Somebody else can do it a lot better than I can. It's probably true, but you still have to. I don't know that it's true. There's always somebody better, right?
His attitude changed tremendously, though, from when he killed the Egyptian to now. So it's almost like he went from this fervor and zeal to this broken man.
Reluctance.
Sometimes we have that too. We're very zealous and energetic, and then over time, you just discouragement after discouragement, you finally just say, I can't, I'm done.
Yeah.
Somebody else obviously can do it.
Yeah. Do it.
That's Satan being on me.
Yeah.
You got to stand past that.
So now, kind of going back to this idea that, all right, so here's this Old Testament story. in this ancient book, talking about things that I will never experience. What does that have to do with me? It reminds us, again, the idea that we need to see God as He is. We need to place ourselves in His presence. At the very least, we need to recognize that that's where we are, right? We are in God's presence. So what are we going to do about that? Again, we could come up with all kinds of excuses. New Testament, a man by the name of Felix. What did Felix do? Kind of a combination of some of these things that we already heard. When he heard Paul, wasn't it Felix? When he heard Paul teach about righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, what did Felix do? Trembled. Yeah. So he was, no doubt, he was convicted in some ways, trembled. He trembled. He knew that his life was not right before God. But it did not motivate him enough to do anything about it. In fact, he did call for, when I have a more convenient season, he says, I'll call for you. And he did call for him, but what was he hoping to get out of that? Money, yeah, bribe. Not the most important thing. So conviction is essential to a right relationship with God. That is, I need to be convicted about who I am and what my standing is before Him. Knowing then that He is who He is and what He is, then I need to surrender to Him. I mean, that's what this all comes down to. Again, you're no Moses, and God has not called on you to lead an entire nation of rebellious people out into a wilderness in hopes of getting them to the place that God promised, only to find out that they just won't do it. He hasn't tasked you with that.
What if he did?
But
What if he did?
But
Tasked with something like that. Something.
that's still the question. That's still the question, isn't it? So what do we do with the things that He does call on us to do? If I won't do the small things, surely I can't expect myself to do the big things. Oh, if I had $1 million, I would give it. You've heard the story about the guy on the plane. Got into a bunch of turbulence, things were going crazy, and he finally just vowed to God out loud, I'll give you half of everything that I own if you allow me to get safely back to the ground. A few minutes later, they landed safely. A guy came up to him, tapped him on the shoulder, and said, hey, I'm a preacher. I heard what you said. And he said, don't worry about it. I prayed again to God and told Him if I ever got back on the plane, I'd give Him everything. What do we do with what we have? Right? If I had $1 million, this is what I do. Well, you got 10. What are you doing with that? If I had 20 talents and all of these abilities, this is what I would do for God. Well, what are you doing with what you have?
Well, I would submit just one thing that you just said, that God has actually called each one of us to do more than what He called Moses to do. He called Moses simply, I say simply, I don't mean it that way, that's true.
No.
He called Moses to go to one nation. He calls His people to go to all nations. And that's a pretty big deal. And I think, I look at my life and I know how I have failed that call so many times, because it's and I think we live in a world where it's proven time and time again, it is the biggest obstacle to someone coming to Christ is the will. It's it. Will I surrender or will I not surrender? That's it.
That's
it's
it.
Plain obstinance. It's not ignorance. It's plain obstinance. I don't want to. I want to do it my way.
Right.
I like it this way and not God's way. But we've definitely been called, I think, to something
greater
bigger
things.
And greater than what Moses was called.
I'm glad you said that, because I almost followed up and then I went elsewhere. I almost followed up that sentence by, He has not called you to do this, He's called you to save the entire world. It is a big task, isn't it? But is God just? Is he fair? Yeah. Is He going to judge us for something that he commands us that he knows that we could never accomplish? That was a long way of saying something else. Let me rephrase that. Is God going to judge us for something that we can't do? Is he going to condemn us for something that we're unable to do when he told us to do it? No. There is no perfect time to later obey the gospel. The time is when? Today. That's the watchword of the Bible, right? Today. Today's the day of salvation. All excuses aside. Okay, here's what we're transitioning into the invitation now. So here's the deal. What about you? Have you surrendered yourself to God? Again, not with him appearing in a burning bush, but he's presented himself clearly in his inspired word that proves itself to be divine. The book is amazing. It allows us to look into it. God places us in his presence. He demonstrates his own nature, and he calls on us to participate with him in redemption. He wants to save us. The burning bush was not about a bush that was not consumed with fire. It was about your soul. Because Moses has to step into the role that God has given him. He's got to lead God's people to the place where they're supposed to be, so they can flourish as a nation and bring about the seed. The book of Exodus is about your redemption and mine. So what do we do when we come face to face with the reality that God is real and he's going to hold you accountable? And he calls on you to believe in his Son, to repent of sin, confess your faith in Christ, and be baptized for the remission of sins. What are you going to do with that information? Fight it? I did for a little while. Ultimately, though, will you surrender to it? That's obedience to God. Obeying him on his terms, in his way, according to his standard. Moses fought that. Aren't you tired of fighting that? Stop fighting God's will. Stop resisting. Surrender. If we can assist you tonight in any way, let us know as we stand and sing.